For 47 straight years, the Islamic Republic of Iran never once admitted weakness. Not when American hostages were paraded through the streets of Tehran for 444 days. Not when an entire generation of young Iranian men was fed into the meat grinder of the 8-year war with Saddam Hussein's Iraq. Not through wave after wave of crushing sanctions, international isolation, targeted killings of their top nuclear scientists, or sabotage operations that quietly crippled their facilities from the inside. Through every single crisis the world threw at them, the message from the regime to its own population and to the watching world stayed exactly the same. We are the resistance. We do not bow. We do not break. We do not beg for mercy from anyone. Until this week. Because something has just happened inside Iran that the founders of their revolution would have called absolutely impossible. Something that 47 years of carefully manufactured revolutionary mythology was specifically built to prevent from ever happening. Iran has quietly delivered to the United States a peace proposal with a 30-day deadline stamped on it. And not because the regime is negotiating from a position of strength, not because of brilliant strategy or diplomatic skill. They are asking for peace because the clock has run out on them, and they know it. The one detail buried inside that proposal, the detail that tells you absolutely everything you need to understand about how bad the situation inside Iran has actually become, has nothing to do with uranium enrichment levels. It has nothing to do with regional security frameworks or prisoner swaps. It is about oil storage tanks. Iran is right now shutting down crude oil production, not because they want to, but because their storage tanks are filling up to the brim and there is nowhere left to put the oil. And if those tanks overflow, the wells themselves could be permanently destroyed. The same regime that outlasted everything the world threw at it for nearly half a century is now sending peace plans with deadlines because it is afraid of its own oil fields. Let that sink in for a moment. Then let me show you why what comes next changes the entire game. First, we have to walk through the timeline that pushed Iran into this corner, because the speed of this collapse matters just as much as the collapse itself. The American naval blockade that effectively shut down every major Iranian port beginning in mid-April of 2026 was never, from Washington's perspective, primarily a military operation. It was an economic strangulation carried out using military tools. The goal was never to sink Iranian warships or flatten Iranian infrastructure. The goal was to choke off the money. To cut the Islamic Republic off from the river of oil revenue that pays for absolutely everything the regime depends on to stay in power. Their armed forces, their network of proxy fighters spread across the region, their internal security services, the salaries that buy the loyalty of the Revolutionary Guard, and the subsidies that keep ordinary Iranians from rising up in open revolt against the men who rule them. Cut the oil money, and you do not need to invade. You do not need boots on the ground in Tehran. You do not even need to fire a single shot. You simply wait while the entire system that depends on that revenue collapses inward under its own weight. Treasury Secretary Bessent described it with a precision that deserves close attention. He said for 12 months the United States was running a marathon. Now America is sprinting toward the finish line. The regime is being suffocated. They cannot pay their soldiers. Those are not the careful words of a diplomat trying to manage a crisis. Those are the words of the man describing a process that is already working and is now being accelerated. The race is no longer about whether the blockade will eventually break Iran's economy. The race is about how quickly. And the answer, judging by every single signal coming out of Iran right now, is far faster than the regime ever planned for. Pay close attention to what Iran is actually doing versus what Iran is publicly saying, because the gap between those two things is exactly where the truth of the regime's situation lives. Iran's Ministry of Industry spokesmen are telling the world that recent price increases are just artificial market manipulation. They claim the economy is adapting. They claim the oil sector has decades of experience and is not concerned. They claim everything is firmly under control. But what the regime is actually doing tells a completely different story. They are cutting crude oil production before they are forced to, not after the tanks fill up, but before. Because the regime's own engineers have done the calculations and they understand a brutal truth. If they wait until storage hits maximum capacity, the pressure dynamics throughout the entire production network could damage the wells in ways that cannot be quickly or cheaply reversed. Shutting down oil wells that have been pumping for decades is not like flipping off a kitchen tap. It is a delicate and complicated engineering operation with long-term consequences for reservoir pressure and future production capacity. The decision to preemptively cut output to avoid hitting storage limits is not a confident strategic choice. It is a desperate move to prevent an operational disaster that would turn a severe but recoverable economic crisis into a permanent crippling of Iran's single most important revenue-generating asset. Senior Iranian officials are calling these cuts precautionary, which is true in the same way that a man describing the tourniquet wrapped around his bleeding arm as being precautionary. Yes, technically he is preventing a worse outcome. He is also showing you a wound that is already very serious. Operation Economic Fury is the name given to the Treasury Department's parallel campaign of sanctions, asset freezes, and financial network disruption running alongside the naval blockade. And the specific reason it is working better than every previous American financial pressure campaign against Iran is not really about the sanctions themselves. It is about who is now actively cooperating with them. For years, the financial system of the United Arab Emirates served as the primary leak point in American sanctions architecture aimed at Iran. Dubai and Abu Dhabi quietly hosted the shell companies, the front corporations, the back-channel financial institutions, and the informal money transfer networks that allowed the IRGC to move money, buy goods, and maintain working relationships with the global economy despite being under heavy American sanctions. UAE authorities generally looked the other way. The transactions were profitable for Emirati banks. The political cost of cracking down on Iranian financial activity was higher than the benefit. And the diplomatic relationship between Abu Dhabi and Tehran, while always complicated, did not require the UAE to actively help Washington enforce sanctions. Then Iran fired roughly 2,260 drones, along with hundreds of ballistic missiles at UAE cities. They burned the Fujairah terminal. They struck civilian infrastructure inside the Emirates. The calculation flipped overnight. UAE financial institutions are now actively cooperating with American Treasury officials. They are handing over account details, they are facilitating asset freezes, they are doing the detailed financial forensic work that allows Washington to identify, track, and freeze IRGC money that had been hidden inside UAE financial structures for years, and in some cases, for decades. Secretary Bessent confirmed the scale of this shift with language that should be read carefully. He said the IRGC is watching its stolen assets, accumulated over 47 years, get frozen and go down the drain very quickly. 47 years of financial architecture built through corruption, sanctions evasion, front companies, and shell corporations being systematically dismantled in a matter of weeks because Iran chose to attack the one country that had been its primary financial lifeline. The strategic price of those May 4th attacks is not measured only in burned-out oil terminals and intercepted missiles. It is measured in the complete shutdown of the UAE financial corridor that had been keeping the Iranian regime alive. Now consider the Pakistan situation, because this is where the United States is dealing with a complication that has no clean solution. The Iran-Pakistan border has become a visible and frankly embarrassing leak in what Washington wants to present to the world as an airtight economic blockade. Trucks, motorcycles, small boats crossing border waterways, roughly 5 to 6 million liters of Iranian fuel per day flowing into Pakistan through informal crossings, containers moving through official land routes, goods that cannot move through Iranian ports finding their way overland to Pakistani ports, and from there back into the global trading system. President Trump was asked about this leak directly. His answer was telling, not for what it said, but for what it deliberately did not say. Great respect for Pakistan. Great respect for the Field Marshal and the Prime Minister. That is not the answer of a president who has decided to slam this leak shut. That is the answer of a president who is carefully managing a relationship he needs for reasons that go far beyond Iran. Pakistan has nuclear weapons. Pakistan shares a long border with Afghanistan. Pakistan is a critical intelligence partner on multiple issues that have nothing to do with the Iran crisis. Applying the kind of pressure that would actually close the Pakistani land corridor would risk damaging a relationship with consequences stretching well beyond this current confrontation. But here is the cold, mathematical reality that makes this leak, however politically tricky to close, ultimately manageable from Washington's strategic standpoint. A single oil tanker carries roughly 2 million barrels of crude. That is over 84 million gallons of oil moving in one single voyage. Trying to replace that volume with motorcycle convoys, pickup trucks, and small fuel containers crossing remote desert and mountain passes is mathematically impossible. The Pakistani land route is a leak. It is not a replacement. The volume of goods that can physically move through those mountain passes, those desert crossings, those informal border points is a tiny fraction of what Iran was previously moving through its ports before the blockade slammed shut. The regime is using this route to slow the bleeding. They cannot use it to stop the bleeding, and the economic math is merciless on top of all that. Land transport through these routes costs roughly 10 to 12 times more per unit than maritime shipping. Every barrel Iran moves overland costs 10 times what it would cost to move that same barrel through Hormuz on a tanker. The revenue that does make it through this route gets taxed by Pakistani transit fees, eroded by Pakistani smuggling networks, and inflated by land transport costs. What is left over represents only a fraction of the cash flow the regime needs to keep itself functioning. Washington understands all of this, which is why Trump's answer was respect rather than action. The leak is annoying, it is not existential for the blockade's effectiveness, and closing it is not worth the diplomatic cost required, at least not yet. But it is the peace plan itself that tells the full story of where Iran really is, because the details of what Tehran proposed reveal the precise shape of their desperation. The plan has 3 phases. The first phase calls for gradually opening the Strait of Hormuz and lifting the naval blockade. Iran would handle clearing its own sea mines. This phase is requested to begin immediately and to be completed within 30 days. 30 days, not 6 months. Not a year-long negotiating process, 30 days. Because 30 days is roughly how long Iran's financial infrastructure can keep absorbing the current rate of economic compression before the damage starts becoming structural and permanent rather than severe but still recoverable. The second phase involves Iran returning to nuclear enrichment at 3 to 6% under what they call a zero storage principle. This is a massive concession compared to Iran's earlier positions. The regime is essentially offering to give up the enriched uranium stockpile they have spent enormous resources producing in exchange for sanctions relief and an end to the blockade. The nuclear program that was supposed to be the ultimate strategic insurance policy is now being offered up as a bargaining chip. The third phase proposes a regional security dialogue with the Arab neighbors. The same Arab neighbors whose cities Iran was raining ballistic missiles down on barely 30 days before this proposal was even written. Now, anyone with eyes open and a memory longer than a goldfish knows exactly what this looks like. Iran has spent decades using negotiations as a stalling tactic to buy time, regroup, and rearm. Every previous administration fell for it, every single one. The question now is whether Trump falls for it. And his response to the proposal was very telling. He said he could not imagine the plan would be acceptable in its current form. He noted that Iran has not yet paid a big enough price for 47 years of global destabilization. He expressed a clear desire to eliminate the remaining 15% of Iran's missile production capability that American and Israeli strikes have not yet reached. He was not dismissing the process. He was setting the price of admission. Washington is not looking for Iran to offer the minimum concessions required to end the blockade. Washington is looking for the kind of structural transformation that 47 years of American pressure has never been able to force. And the Trump administration believes, based on the current trajectory, that the blockade is creating exactly the conditions needed for that kind of transformation. Not a polite diplomatic agreement, a fundamental reshaping of the Iranian regime's capacity and willingness to project destructive power across the region and the world. Here is the historical dimension that makes this moment genuinely without precedent. The Islamic Republic's primary strategic weapon for 47 years was time. Every crisis they ever faced was survived through sheer patience. The hostage crisis lasted 444 days because Iran calculated correctly that America would grow exhausted before Iran broke. The Iran-Iraq War dragged on for 8 years because the regime correctly concluded that Saddam's coalition would burn out before the Islamic Republic collapsed. Nuclear negotiations stretched across decades because Tehran understood that American political cycles and diplomatic fatigue would eventually produce an agreement that let the program keep developing in the background. Time was always on Iran's side. The regime bet its survival, repeatedly and successfully, on the assumption that it could simply outlast its enemies. The blockade has destroyed that calculation at the structural level. Because the blockade is not attacking Iran's willingness to endure, it is attacking Iran's physical capacity to endure. You can endure sanctions if you have enough revenue to keep your security apparatus paid and functioning. You can survive military strikes if you can replace what is destroyed. You can wait out diplomatic pressure if your economic foundation remains intact. But when oil storage hits capacity and wells must be preemptively shut down to avoid permanent damage, when IRGC soldiers cannot be paid because asset freezes have wiped out the financial networks that move their money, when port paralysis has stopped the import of industrial inputs that keep your factories running, when the Russian and Chinese technical experts who are keeping your critical infrastructure functioning have been pulled out by their governments, when the land routes that were supposed to be your escape valve cost 10 times times more than sea freight and carry only a fraction of the volume you actually need, time is no longer your ally. Time is now your enemy. The peace plan with the 30-day deadline is the regime acknowledging, in the most direct way that its ideology and its pride will allow, that the math has fundamentally changed. Survival through patience is no longer possible. The choice is no longer between resistance and compromise. It is between negotiating now, while the regime still exists as a functioning entity, capable of being a party to a negotiation, or continuing to resist until the question of what to negotiate becomes meaningless. Trump's statement about Iran's remaining missile infrastructure deserves precise reading. 85% of Iran's missile production capability has been destroyed. He would like to eliminate the rest. He is also reviewing the peace proposal. He is leaving the door open while making absolutely clear what stands behind the door he is leaving closed. This is not a president carefully managing escalation to avoid miscalculation. This is a president who believes he is close to a comprehensive outcome and is calibrating the remaining pressure to extract maximum concessions before accepting any deal at all. The fact that he is reviewing the Iranian proposal is not a sign of American willingness to settle for what Iran is offering. It is a sign that Washington is calculating whether the regime's current desperation can be converted into the kind of structural concessions that no previous American administration was ever in a position to even demand. The nuclear enrichment capacity, the missile infrastructure, the proxy network financing, the IRGC's parallel economic empire, the ability to threaten the Strait of Hormuz, the capacity to project destructive power across the region through Hezbollah, the Houthis, and Iraqi militia networks. Washington is not looking for Iran to pause these capabilities. Washington is looking for Iran to surrender them entirely. And the blockade, according to Secretary Bessent, is now sprinting toward the finish line. Look at everything that has converged at exactly this moment to bring Iran to this point. The naval blockade has stopped maritime exports and imports. Oil storage is at or near capacity. Wells are being preemptively idled to prevent permanent damage. The land bridge through Pakistan is a tiny fraction of needed trade volume at 10 times the cost. The UAE financial corridor, Iran's primary sanctions evasion infrastructure, is being actively dismantled with full Emirati cooperation. Russian and Chinese technical personnel have been pulled out, leaving critical infrastructure without operational expertise. IRGC soldiers are reportedly going unpaid. Internal resistance is penetrating IRGC security. The proxy network is degraded. The Arab coalition is forming. 85% of missile production capability is destroyed, and Iran has now submitted a peace plan with a 30-day deadline. The regime that outlasted Saddam is running out of time. The regime that waited out the hostage crisis for 444 days is now proposing a 30-day timeline for relief. The regime that spent 47 years telling the world that American pressure would break before the Islamic Republic does, is now the one begging for the pressure to stop. What just happened is not just a peace proposal. It is the clearest signal the Islamic Republic has ever sent about its own assessment of its survival prospects. And the signal says that the regime does not believe it can survive the current pressure for much longer. Whether Washington accepts the terms being offered, demands more, or simply continues the blockade until the regime has no choice but to accept whatever terms are placed in front of it, that calculation is being made over the next 30 days. The 47-year war of endurance that the Islamic Republic believed was its ultimate strength has finally hit a wall it cannot wait out. The oil wells are being idled, the money is frozen, the soldiers are not being paid, the allies are gone. And the peace plan is sitting on Trump's desk. And now we have to talk about something nobody inside the regime wants to say out loud. Something that is happening on the streets of Tehran, Isfahan, Shiraz, and Mashhad right now that the Islamic Republic has spent 47 years trying to prevent. The Iranian people themselves are no longer afraid. For decades, the regime survived not because it was loved by its own population, but because it was feared. The Revolutionary Guard, the besieged militia, the morality police, the intelligence services, all of them worked together to make sure that any spark of resistance was crushed before it could spread. Public hangings, mass arrests, disappearances in the night, show trials broadcast on state television to send a message to anyone who dared to even think about speaking out. That fear is breaking, and it is breaking for a very simple reason. When the regime cannot pay its own soldiers, when the IRGC officers are watching their bank accounts get frozen, when the besieged thugs who used to beat protesters in the streets are now wondering whether their salaries will arrive next month, the entire machinery of fear stops working. A regime that runs on terror needs paid enforcers, and paid enforcers need to actually get paid. Reports coming out of Iran right now describe something that would have been unimaginable just 6 months ago. IRGC checkpoints standing empty. Besiege units refusing to deploy against protesters. Mid-level commanders quietly reaching out to opposition networks to negotiate their own survival in whatever comes next. The regime is hollowing out from the inside, and the men with the guns are starting to do the math on which side they want to be standing on when this is finally over. Meanwhile, ordinary Iranians, mothers, fathers, students, shopkeepers, truck drivers, are watching their currency collapse, their savings evaporate, their grocery store shelves empty out, and their government tell them everything is fine. They know it is not fine. They have known for years. What is different now is that they can see the end. They can see that the men who stole their country 47 years ago, who killed their sons in pointless wars, who imprisoned their daughters for showing their hair, who turned a once prosperous nation into a pariah state, are finally running out of options. And when a population that has been waiting decades for this moment senses that the wall is about to come down, they stop being passive. They start positioning themselves for what comes next. This is what regime collapse actually looks like in real time. Not a single dramatic moment, not one big explosion, 1,000 small cracks all opening at once, soldiers going unpaid, allies pulling out, oil tanks filling up, money getting frozen, fear evaporating. And at the very top, in the marble halls where the supreme leader still issues defiant statements to state television, the slow, awful realization that the game is finally, truly over.